Hello and welcome to the latest video from me, Fiona Mullen at Sapienza Economics. Today I'm going to present to you a short talk I gave in Limassol in March at the Successful Business Leaders Club run by Natalia Kardash. It was held at the Limassol Chamber of Commerce, and as I say, it was run by Natalia Kardash, who runs, among other things, the Best Invest Congress, which is celebrating its 10-year anniversary this year. So I looked at macroeconomy, I looked at energy, geopolitics and domestic politics and what might be the risks in any of these, and I came to some conclusions. So the first thing at the very top macroeconomic level is that Cyprus is outpacing its peers in real GDP growth. In 2004, it grew by 3.4%. Eurozone average was only 0.9%. And this year, in early March, I was still forecasting 2.3% for Cyprus growth this year. I've now upgraded that to 2.9%. I'm going to be cautious about taking it any higher because of all the uncertainties coming out of the US at the moment. And these strong growth rates have come despite losing its number 2 tourism market. So in 2019, you've heard me talk about this before, Russia was number 2, it's now number 17. And although it's difficult to pin down exactly whether this drop in the registered companies was Russian, it's a fair assumption that they were, because new EU sanctions on trusts came into force in August 2022, and you see a sudden drop in business registrations. And then again, there were very, very high penalties if you didn't register who was the ultimate beneficial owner of your company back in late 2024, and we saw another drop-off then. The fiscal situation is very stable. Back in the crisis years of 2013, we had no money in the bank and a lot of money to pay. I'm talking about the Cyprus economy. But last year, they had a big fat budget surplus of 4.4% of GDP. And an even bigger primary surplus, that's the surplus excluding interest payments. And for that reason, we've seen the debt-GDP ratio falling. If it doesn't drop below 60% of GDP this year, I will eat my hat. So it's going to be among the lowest in Europe. There is tax reform coming. The University of Cyprus has presented a whole bunch of proposals, a group of economists. According to their calculations, Cyprus would be number 3 according to the OECD's International Tax Competitiveness Index rankings. Unfortunately, Cyprus is not in this list because of the Cyprus problem. Cyprus isn't in the OECD. But if you were to use the same methodology, Cyprus comes out at number 3 today, and they calculated that it would come out at number 3 after the proposed reforms. The problem is for the corporate tax, and this is really mainly international business. The corporate tax proposals, they're good for me. I pay higher corporate tax. It goes from 12.5% to 15%, but I pay a lot less withholding tax, which is the tax on dividends, so tax on any distributed profits. And the reason why this gets worse for international companies is because non-residents don't pay tax on dividends, whereas I'm resident, so I do pay tax. Banks, I didn't show any figures, but they are very highly liquid. They're almost too liquid. So you'd have to have a very, very, very long bank run for them to get into the kind of trouble we had back in 2013. They also have a lot of capital. They're very well capitalized these days. The biggest bulk of the banking system is directly supervised by Frankfurt anyway these days. But in a way, a byproduct of all of this is we've got a concentration and an increasing concentration of banks, which means, of course, less competition. So what does that mean? It means Cypriots pay more for their housing loans. It means businesses pay more for their business loans than in the Eurozone average. What is my biggest concern in the short term is energy blackouts. You've seen me probably write about this in written articles on this Substack newsletter/publication. And there I explained the culmination of years of vested interests and so on means that we're really running into trouble this summer. We don't have any liquefied natural gas imports. We don't have any domestic gas production. And even if we did, that's all going to Egypt. It's not coming here. The renewable storage is running behind schedule. They're running to try and see if they can get enough storage, but it's not going to be this summer. The grid infrastructure, there's lack of investment in that. Again, they're running to catch up. The free electricity market, which theoretically should bring more people on board, we'll see. That's supposed to start in July. I don't know if it will at this stage. The electricity cable, the Great Sea Interconnector, that's supposed to be bringing electricity from Crete to Cyprus, that's running behind schedule. That has issues relating to Turkey. And there is extra energy demand this year because we have a massive drought. So we need desalination plants. They are very, very energy hungry. And they're expecting more tourists than ever. They use a lot of energy. And of course, if the temperatures are like they were last year, we're going to have a really hot summer, hotter than usual. So we're really relying on emergency measures. On the politics, the good news is that even though we are nowhere near starting fully fledged negotiations to solve the Cyprus problem, the two sides, or four sides, if you count Greece and Turkey, are now talking to each other, formal/informal, depending on which format. But the good thing is they have started talking. There was a UN-led big meeting in Geneva, and that's good news for reducing the risk of hot incidents. In July 2024, there was an incident between Turkish and Greek naval ships over the interconnector because they're trying to lay the cable now. In maritime areas, there's potential. Eni wants to start producing gas quite soon. Hopefully, if the two sides are talking, they can come to some sort of arrangement to stop Turkey preventing that from happening. And in the buffer zone, only geeks like me notice this, that there are frequent military incursions which could spill over into hotter incidents. Hopefully, the risk of those gets reduced as well. On geopolitics, Cyprus was never part of NATO. It was part of what was called the non-aligned movement in the Cold War, which meant, generally speaking, it was kind of closer to Russia than the US. But it never completely fell out with the US either, especially from the 1970s because of Turkish troops in the north. The Republic of Cyprus has tried very hard to have good relations with basically everyone else apart from Turkey. So all of the Arab countries, Israel, US, Russia, etc. This has started to shift. I've written about this in previous articles. So we now have a shift more towards the US, including plans for bases that won't be called US bases, but to all intents and purposes, people are saying they will be. That, of course, these days could create tensions with the EU. We'll see. But it means that Cyprus will be walking this delicate balance again, but this time between the EU and the US rather than, let's say, Russia and the West. Domestic politics is stable. The next presidential election is 2028. Even if the current leadership is not particularly popular, according to opinion polls, they generally get support for economic policies from the opposition Democratic Rally. So it looks like the tax reform will go through, and there certainly won't be an early presidential election. So conclusions, macroeconomy is kind of stable, even though growth is slowing. The biggest short-term risk is on energy. If you have big factories or big hotels, you really need to have a generator. Geopolitics, obviously, it's daily whiplash at the moment. What is going on around us? So watch out for curveballs. Worst case scenario, Turkey is very strong these days because of Syria and so on. So there's a risk of moves by an emboldened Turkey, but the fact that the two sides are talking is good. And there's another risk that one day President Trump wakes up and decides that the UN peacekeeping force has been here long enough and ends up vetoing the next renewal, which happens in January. It only takes one veto and then they have to go. So again, that explains why Cyprus is keeping very close to the US. So that's it from me for this week. I do this monthly in-depth Sapienta country analysis Cyprus. It's my premium product. It's taken by the biggest companies, governments, you name it, in the world. And it's not cheap. So if you can't afford that, you are now able to support me for this newsletter on Substack. It's only €49 a year. I've kept it very low, but it really, really does help to be able to be supported for this. Thank you for listening.